Esports is supposed to be the next big thing. With a lot of major physical sports declining in viewership and gaming on the rise, esports is set to take a giant chunk of that viewership pie, but there's actually a major problem. Esports is struggling immensely right now. But why? Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers that is preventing games from becoming successful esports. And this starts off with just the games themselves. And this leads many people to ask, what actually makes a good esports game? And the first thing that you need is the game to be backed by the company that made it. And this seems kind of obvious, right? A game would want to support their esports scene, but this is not always true. For instance, Nintendo has consistently thwarted any effort to create a lasting and sustainable esports scene for Smash Bros. And the entire franchise. The fact that these games and this esports scene is alive at all is testament to the fans' enjoyment of the game, and often done in spite of Nintendo's best efforts to thwart it from even existing. I'm talking tournaments being shut down, content being copyrighted, and Nintendo doing everything they possibly can to distinguish themselves as an anti-esport company. I think that not trying to shut down your esport is like bare minimum, but having a company that has prize pools, balance, and updates, and fixing certain bugs in the game is like a bare minimum to back a competitive game. But then outside of that, it's also the game's general success as a whole. From regular sports to esports and anything in between, the casual audience of anything is always going to be vastly bigger than the competitive one. And in order for you to have a thriving and populated competitive sector, you need the game's overall audience to be rather large and the game to be a success overall. So games that are hyper designed to be competitive successes but don't manage to appeal to a wider audience are also most likely going to fail. Now, the third reason, and this is a very important thing that will build your games up or prevent them from ever becoming truly established esports, is the overall game life cycle. And here's what you need to understand. Games need to stick around for a long time before they have the chance to become a cemented esport that people understand. The longer something sticks around, the more the average person will understand the game, resonate with the players. And while this might seem like an obvious concept, you got to understand that a lot of people are trying to thrust a game to become an esport far earlier than the game realistically should be. Think about every single traditional physical sport and how long they have been around. Having an established life cycle with consistent support for a long period of time allows players to truly get to understand these games, making it easier to understand the rules more often that you come and revisit the game over a long period of time, and more ingrained into the overall life cycle of the pros that are in the scene. This means that if you're designing a game to be an esport, you really should be designing a game to stick around for as long as possible, because that's going to increase your chances it will be successful. And if you launch a game and then instantly thrust yourself into the esports sector, you're probably going to have a lot of things working against you. Now, I will say that some games cheat in this regard by creating a more polished version of an existing game and then using the existing rules and audience of said game to create a certain overlap into the new game. The biggest example in recent times is Valorant, taking a lot of what worked in Counter-Strike, a lot of the same rule sets, and applying it to the new game, and trying to grab a lot of the existing audience of CSGO, or at least people that have played it in the past, and that's how they cheat, by creating something that is similar but different enough to have its own identity. Now, the second thing is the most difficult part about making a successful esport is that games have to remain semi-similar their whole life. While it's obvious that a game should stick around if it wants to live, it's also equally important to have a game that doesn't completely change fundamentally from its inception to later stages in its life. For instance, a game where if you put it down for a year and picked it up again and it feels like a completely different game doesn't actually feel like a game that has been stuck around. And while games that constantly fundamentally change can be very interesting from a casual audience, from a competitive audience, it creates a lot of problems with consistency and skill, consistency and viewer experience, and generally people just being able to come in and stop by watching a game and understanding what's happening, even if they don't consistently keep up with every single change. One of the biggest examples of this is a game like Fortnite, where if you look at the gameplay now compared to the gameplay close to the start of launch, it looks very, very different, and you could say that it's not even the same game in a lot of ways. Now, this is really the hardest thing, in my opinion, about creating an esports title, because you have to not update your game too much, or rather stay away from things that fundamentally change the core aspects of your game, but you can't have zero additions to a new game, because then the game becomes stale and a lot of people lose their interest, and the general game success also falls, so the competitive sector also falls. Now, I think there's two major rules that a developer can follow to make sure that this doesn't happen and set their games up to succeed if they want to be a big esport. First off is have a very compelling start with a fully fledged game that has no gimmicks. I know it's really easy to hop on whatever fun thing is going on in development at the time, but having a rock solid fun game that doesn't rely on silly gimmicks that are coming around every once in a while. Essentially, you're building the game for a long term and not really trying to grab onto anything too new in the overall game market meta. And then also have constant additional features, but that primarily target the casual players with little pros or no fundamental changes to the pro or more competitive side of things. Now, there's a lot of examples I could pull from, but first, a bad example would be Overwatch. A game that had several fundamental changes, including having huge changes to the rule set, changes to role lock, going down from 6 players to 5 players, characters that were so powerful that fundamentally changed the way that the game was played. But on the flip side, we had Counter-Strike, a game that had very little changes to its most competitive sector, but still had constant additional features, tons of depth as far as sub-games, mini-games, extra maps that the community has made. There's a lot of depth on the casual side, but it doesn't mean that the game is overall getting fundamentally changed, and its core gameplay is still intact, especially in its high ranks and its pro play. It's not like guns are being replaced with laser guns, characters are randomly given mobility, things could all of a sudden fly, and all these rules are being broken. And even a game like Valorant that takes these elements to the extreme still keeps its core gameplay intact, and the guns are very similar to how they were at launch. The game overall has the same premise and concept, and even with the new addition to agents, it doesn't feel and play like a completely different game from a year later. Every single time you play it, it's gonna still feel like Valorant, just like Counter-Strike is gonna feel like Counter-Strike. And there's definitely a line that can be crossed here and played around with, but at the end of the day, changes are fine, but with the still structure of core gameplay elements that remain intact. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only roadblock to esports. Having all of these things correct can be a really big driving factor, but there are other outside of game factors that hold esports back across the board, and the first one is low money in esports. Oftentimes in esports, it's publisher or developer take all, where most of the money goes to the high end, specifically around the sale of games, in-game items, or something like skins. When you see companies like Riot Games record $1.5 billion in revenue in 2022, that's primarily based off of skin sales. But the reality of it is, for esports to work, you need organizations that are hosting players, paying them salaries, and paying their fees to go compete in actual tournaments consistently. And this is the really hard part, because where are the orgs getting money to pay all of these salaries? Sure, the games are popular, but how are the organizations actually making any money? A lot of the time, organizations need to find their own ways to utilize the players' success and clout to drive traffic to their own form of revenue generation, and this is even more difficult when the general audience of esports is young and poor more often than not. When you compare directly to normal sports, the average age is much higher, people can actually pay for things a lot more consistently, and the majority of people that actually buy things when it comes to esports and esports titles, they're primarily buying skins, money that is not going to any of the organizations or the players. On top of that, there's going to be less ad rates and high money sponsors because of the audience. And this is a part that will get fixed over time as esports survive and grow. There will be more money in esports, but I really think the timeline for this is a lot longer than many people project, where it's not just going to be 5-10 years from now, especially in this economy. It's going to take a bit longer for any people to get to a substantial point where they are watching, actively interested in, and investing in esports as fully grown adults with lots of money to spend. Now, a lot of the ways that orgs try to make this money is with content. They try to utilize what they have and the talent that they have to create content pieces that create revenue for them. But the problem with this is that orgs are really bad most of the time at creating content, especially as someone who has seen the inside of many esports companies. Most of the time, orgs are poorly run, primarily because they are held up by investments. Go look at any of the top esports orgs that you can think of. TSM, FaZe, Optic Gaming, which owns Dallas Fuel for Overwatch, and every single one of these companies has huge amounts of millions of dollars of investments raised. We're talking in the tens of millions of dollars, where these companies go to Silicon Valley, raise venture capital money or VC money, and they utilize it to grow their esports teams, pay their players, and expand into esports. But really, all these companies are never built on profitability, only promises. The promise that esports will grow, the promise that the growth of esports will raise every single one of these companies, and most of the time, these companies are just a 5% diversity portfolio for some rich billionaire somewhere. Now, this is even worse for orgs when orgs all of a sudden have to be profitable after just spending exuberant amounts of money into growing and paying their staff and players, and now they have to make money somehow, and they're going to do it with a couple of merch sales and a little bit of content. That's not going to happen very reliably. However, companies could actually fix this problem. And I'm talking about the publisher or the developers of these games. They could fix the problem. Because remember, most of the value and most of the revenue is being generated by skin sales. So if you could give the org somehow a slice of that pie, you could actually fix this problem. And first off is the creator codes, where Fortnite did this for a while, where if you're a creator or an org, you create a piece of content, or maybe it's on your players' jerseys or whatever the case may be, they use the code when buying skins, and you get like 5 to 10% of whatever is generated. You're driving the traffic and you get paid for it, and that can be a huge amount of money. Even a tiny slice of the skin sales could be a huge amount of money, capable of creating profitability for many of these orgs. That being said, you would somehow have to convince the developers or the producers themselves to give up a slice of their money, which for a lot of public traded companies would be very difficult to convince them of, even if in the long run it empowers creators and orgs in a way that actually pays back the company's life cycle and the game life cycle, with dividends going back into making the game more popular and more sustainable. Now, the other thing that you could do is have pro team skins. One of the few things that Halo Infinite did right is they had a lot of the top orgs have skins that they designed and were put into the game, that they got a huge percentage of whatever those skins sold for in revenue back to the orgs. This can be a fantastic way in order to integrate esports with the game itself, provide revenue for the orgs themselves, and basically allow an org to invest to create a team in a game, knowing that if their team actually performs decently well, they will be able to actually recoup that revenue. Because for the most part, for orgs, even if they're the best team, their teams are popping off and they're consistently winning, it doesn't actually matter. They will not make a return on their investment. And as you can see, some companies have experimented with some of these ideas, but no individual game has done them all and combined it, most importantly, with having a good fundamental game that we talked about in the first section. And I think if a game combined all three, they would be on a fast track to success as an esport. Now, the next major thing that you have to understand is that an esport needs to sell the dream. And no one does this better than Riot Games, and especially Riot Games in Korea. They sell the dream that someone could be born, aspire, and actually become a pro if you work hard. And being a pro player means lots of money, maybe lots of glory, especially in Korea, where a lot of pro players are actually treated like semi-celebrities, and establishing a legitimate path to pro, or a outline for players to become pro players from wherever they are currently. It's in the best interest of these esports to lay out a literal blueprint and empower that path to pro, so that people can believe and aspire to be pros, not only being interested in the esports, but actively participating in the life cycle of becoming one. Now, this is where having orgs that survive, and even small orgs that have a way to actually return a certain amount of revenue, is super important for the life cycle of a game, because having a healthy tier 2 and 3 scene is very important. Right now, in a lot of pro games, we have a winner take all, which means that there's a huge divide between the teams that are in like a franchising or tier 1 league and the players that are outside of it. You're either making a ton of money or you're making none of it. And this is really bad because it makes it very hard to actually chase that path to pro. If there's not a reliable system in place that encourages orgs to invest in a tier 2 or tier 3 and have actual players that can be paid maybe a small salary but something on their route to become legitimate tier 1 players, then it's going to be very hard for your esport to thrive at a fundamental organic level. Now, with some games, there's definitely ways to play around this, like cash cups in Fortnite, where there were ways for, if you were a skilled player, to consistently make money on certain weekends, which I think is a brilliant idea but hard to implement in games. But it can undoubtedly build and grow a certain tier 2 and tier 3 scene by just providing a small amount of revenue back to the players that are participating in the ecosystem. Now, this really moves us on to the third and maybe most important problem that is preventing esports from blowing up right away, and that's the interest cycles of change. First off, there's a lot of genres and subgenres inside gaming as a whole that have highs and lows of popularity. Just in the FPS genre alone, we have extraction shooters, battle royales, tac shooters, arena shooters, and anything in between, and all of these get various popularity spikes. I mean, the battle royale genre didn't really exist more than 5-6 years ago, and it came up out of nowhere. And who knows if something will replace it down the line or if it will continue to thrive. We have no idea. In addition to that, there are other genres of games that become popular variously, like MOBAs, MMOs, FPSs, card games. There's everything in between, and these genres become different levels of popularity depending on just time passing and the games that are introduced, and it's hard to predict a lot of these trends. Now, this is really compounded by the fact that technology is constantly changing. GPUs, CPUs, and internet connection is all getting better, and technology is constantly changing. What's possible to be created could be vastly different, like maybe next year or 10 years from now. An amazing virtual reality game that revolutionizes pro play could come out of nowhere. Or with advancements to artificial intelligence, we could see extraction shooters make a new name for themselves in esports as a whole. And you gotta understand that with interest cycles changing and technology changing, you realize that every single game has a lot of things working against it in order to maintain a long, consistent audience. Because that was one of the key points in making an esport work, is that it has to be popular, generally popular, for a very long period of time without introducing that much fundamental change. But when every single year, a new popular genre with a new popular technology added to it gets created and implemented in the scene, it's pulling players away. And it's like the constant new thing is almost driving out a lot of the consistency that is needed for an esports scene to be organically grown, leaving companies to force its growth, which causes many of the extra problems that we talked about previously in this video. Now, that being said, this doesn't mean that esports is fully dead. In fact, I think that a lot of what's happening right now is needed for esports to truly grow. Organizations need to learn to adapt to a non-venture capital funding meta, understanding that they can't just get checkbook after checkbook to empower their teams and play their players. They need to find another way to be sustainable. And we're already seeing aspects of that with companies like 100 Thieves investing in other things like high quality merch and even their own energy drink brand. A very similar thing happened with a lot of companies that lived or died back during the tech bubble, where a lot of companies that you know now, many of the big tech companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, these are just the companies that survived. There's a million other companies that were created that were successful in one point that ultimately did die, and we're going to see very similar things to esports titles and organizations that have teams within those titles. The last thing that you need to understand is that we only need a few winners in the long run. I suspect that there will be a couple of core winners. We already have some games like Counter-Strike and League of Legends that have very, very long life cycles that keep evolving but keep what's fundamental to the game, especially with CSGO coming out, still keeping the lifeblood of what makes Counter-Strike Counter-Strike, but adding enough new features that make things exciting and fresh. And even in spite of CSGO 2, CSGO has still been thriving and consistent, having plenty of content for both the casual and competitive player alike. Same thing with League of Legends, but even still, with everything that these games are doing right, I still think that there is room for companies to come along, create esports titles that do things even better, empowering their orgs, their creators, selling the dream, and cementing a path to pro. I do suspect that we will see a lot of these winners over the long run, but also esports is gonna be on a longer timeline than many people expect. I don't expect to see esports take over out of nowhere. It's gonna be a long, slow grind where 10, 20, maybe even 30 years from now, we'll have some established titles that people have been playing for a very long time, where you played it as a kid and your kids are playing it as they're growing up, and esports will become successful, but they still won't replace traditional sports in the way that many people expect they will. The physicality of sports is not only important for just general health, but also very irreplaceable in my personal opinion. And even though I do think that there is an established place for esports, it needs to be alongside traditional physical sports, not as something that will come along and replace it. But anyways, these are just my thoughts as to what's going on with esports. Let me know if you have any questions, concerns, agree or disagree in the comments down below. Press that like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you next time.